Hey everyone, it's Patchy Bunter Acropolis, and today we're going to talk about how to make your Splitting Steel Trickster just ascend into the absolute moon. Today we're talking about the long-awaited mid-game update for Splitting Steel Trickster, which is going to bring quite a lot of new technology and quite a lot of upgrades to your build that are going to make it so strong that you could pretty much laugh at both Uber bosses and Tier 17 maps with relative ease. This is the culmination of all the new tech that we found over the past 2 weeks of playing this build, and at the same time, there's going to be quite a lot of new gear upgrades that we're going to be able to make simply due to corpse crafting being so strong. They're going to be able to make yourself unbelievably strong gear, and in some cases, pretty close to near mirror tier gear for only 10 to 20 div per piece. This is meant to be a path to building that's going to be going over a 50 to 70 div budget plus a Nimis on top of that, which basically means it's going to be around a 140 div budget in the end due to Nimis prices being really high right now. And this budget should pretty much be enough to let you pretty much make all the game trivial except for Valdo's Maps specifically. This is not the end of this build, and there's going to be a lot more you can add to this to make this even stronger, and eventually you'll be able to even laugh at Valdo's Maps with this build. But if you do manage to put yourself everything in this path of building, you'll pretty much be able to do what I've been doing in the B-roll in the background, just immediately killing bosses with no issues and pretty much walking through a Deadly Mirror T17 map with literally zero problems. Now, before we go any further, the first thing I need to talk about is going to be the note section in this path of building. I have put a lot of time and effort into this note section, and I please implore you to read through it and see if any of your questions are answered here. This path of building is going to talk about every single item slot and all the changes and all the upgrades we're going to make for them, as well as have a crafting guide for each section that is going to tell you exactly how to make each of the items in this path of building. Not only that, but at the top of the note section, there's also going to be an FAQ talking about quite a lot of the questions that people have been having about the build, which should hopefully answer any questions that you might have. I really recommend to read through these note sections whenever you have a chance, as it's pretty much going to go over everything that we talked about in the video, but in a written format, as well as give you some more context and some things that we might gloss over in the video. With that said, let's talk about the biggest change for this build, and that's going to be the passive tree rework. Now, previously, we were playing this build with a top lift passive tree. We're picking up Elemental Overload, going over to Sovereignty, and picking up some other points over here. But instead, we're simply just going to anoint Sovereignty and then go over to the bottom right section of the Ranger area and pick up Precise Technique, as well as a lot of nodes down here that just make a lot more sense. This change is not going to make you tankier, as you're going to be losing quite a lot of intelligence from all the pathing nodes, as well as losing a natural calm. It's actually going to make you a tiny little bit squishier, but due to how much DPS is available in this section of the tree, it is a no-brainer to swap over to this, especially since it's going to make adding in clusters a lot easier, which actually will overall make you tankier in the future. The whole point of the swap is that it's setting you up for fitting into cluster jewels a lot easier, which is going to give you an unbelievable amount of additional power in this build. To add on to all this, we're then going to also be adding in a Thread of Hope. This Thread of Hope in the Ranger Jewel socket is just way too efficient, just due to being able to give us a lot of passive points that typically we would have wasted a lot of points to get to. Not only that, but allows us to pick up points such as Quick Step, One with Nature, and Primeval Force, which were previously points that we couldn't really pick up just due to how many passive points they required to pick up. With this Thread of Hope, it should be very easy for you to fit in one cluster jewel, and once you get yourself a Resolute Technique and Ephemeral Edge, which is then going to allow you to drop both Acuity and depth perception, you're not going to have any accuracy problems, and you're going to get yourself 8 passive points back, allowing you to fit in a second cluster jewel with no issue. Now, in the path of building, there will be 2 passive trees for you to look at. One that's going to be the passive tree with no Resolute Technique and Ephemeral Edge, and then the other one is going to be with a Resolute Technique and Ephemeral Edge, which should be able to guide you through both versions of the tree. Now, a Resolute Technique and Ephemeral Edge previously was something that we couldn't include in this build, and that was simply just due to it not synergizing with Elemental Overload. Elemental Overload required us to crit to be able to actually proc it, but because we dropped it and because we're now playing Precise Technique, we can pick up a Resolute Technique and Ephemeral Edge, which makes it so we always have a 100% chance to hit, with the downside of it being we just can't crit, but we don't care if we can't crit. It's actually a DPS increase to not ever be able to crit due to Voice of Storms only proccing the lucky roll on non-crits. As I mentioned, as soon as you get yourself this, you're going to be able to fit in a second cluster jewel. Do not think of this as a mandatory item. You can play this build and you can make all these changes just fine without this. It's just the Resolute Technique and Ephemeral Edge will give you 8 passive points back, allowing you to make your build even stronger. In terms of the cluster jewels that you're going to want to include in this, they're going to be very simple. We simply just want to get ourselves a Feed the Fury, Feel the Fight, Martial Prowess cluster jewel that is ideally an 8 passive point cluster with attack damage while holding a shield as the added small passive bonus. You do not need specifically the while holding a shield variant of this. You can also go for the increased damage with attacks version, or if you can't afford either of those, just simply get yourself one that gives you additional damage with claws or stabs or any other sort of useless node. It's completely fine. It's a very minor difference to have a usable added small passive. We simply just want the 3 notables and the 2 jewel sockets that the cluster offers, as those are going to be substantially more important to our build. The final thing to mention about our tree is going to be the addition of a new jewel called Perandus Pact. What Perandus Pact does is it gives you a large circle around the jewel socket that you socketed in, and based on the version of Perandus Pact that you're going to get, in this case, we're going to be using a 3% increased energy shield version, you are going to be gaining additional bonuses on every single small passive point and every notable within the circle. In our case, this means we're going to be getting ourselves 45% increased maximum energy shield from this jewel. This is effectively going to be worth around 1,000 energy shield depending on your setup. In some cases, it might be more, in some cases, it might be less, and somewhere around a 10% DPS increase. There is another variant of this with increased lightning damage, which will give you a tiny little bit more DPS, but it's kind of hard to pass out on 1,000 free energy shield, meaning that we're going to want to use the ES version of it, even though it is a little bit less DPS, just due to the sheer amount of additional EHP it's going to offer us. Finally, the last addition to talk about is going to be the addition of a Flesh and Flame into our build. Now, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to pick up Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker is an amazing defensive tool that is massively underrated by a lot of builds. What it does is it gives you a substantially easier time to get to spell suppression cap, and every time your spell suppression actually triggers, you have a 50% chance to completely start up your energy shield recharge again. Energy shield recharge is a mechanic that only happens if you haven't taken damage for 4 seconds, and it basically gives you 33% of your ES per second until you have full ES. Typically, ES recharge is kind of useless because as soon as you take damage, your ES recharge immediately stops. But what we can do with Spellbreaker is we can then add in Wicked Ward, which makes it so our ES recharge cannot be interrupted if it started up. This means that every single spell against you just has a 50% chance to immediately give you 15% of your ES per second all the way up until you are a max ES. This doesn't show up as an EHP increase in Path to Building, but the amount of additional recovery that this gives you is so great that it pretty much makes all Uber bosses pretty trivial, assuming you don't straight up get one shot. A lot of bosses do spell damage as their actual damage type, meaning that spell suppression not only is very powerful through Spellbreaker, giving you 10% less damage taken from spell suppressed damage, but because of the insane recovery of this, when combined with Soul Drinker, you're going to have a really easy time living everything. Now, the way you're going to want to get this is through a Flesh and Flame combo with either Spellbreaker or Soul Drinker. It doesn't matter which Flesh and Flame you get, and they're typically worth about the same amount as each other due to Soul Drinker not being very popular in most builds. And I would simply just look at the price of both of them and just get yourself the combo of which one is cheaper, and then just simply path over to the other one. I wouldn't look for a Polymath or One Step Ahead combo because those are typically very expensive as they're popular in other shadow builds. But as soon as you get yourself this, you then want to pick up Wicked Ward, and you do not want to get Wicked Ward until you have yourself Spellbreaker, and you're going to feel an immediate massive increase in your EHP. The next thing we should talk about is going to be the skill changes that we're going to make in this build. So the first thing we should talk about is going to be Wrath versus Haste. Over the past few days of playing this build, we've actually learned that Haste feels amazing in this build. It is about a 5% DPS loss over running Wrath, but due to us having so much aura effect in our build, Haste is effectively worth 27% of our movement speed, which is going to feel great for mapping. And at the same time, the attack speed, in my opinion, is going to make bossing feel snappier and your build overall just feel better, which is substantially more important than the 5% DPS loss of running Wrath. Now, obviously, this does mean that if you had a Wrath Watchers, you are going to not be able to benefit from it anymore. But what I would recommend instead to do is potentially find yourself a Haste phasing Watchers instead, as this is going to give you more DPS than the Wrath Watchers would have ever given you. Phasing is important in this build because we want to basically be on top of a boss's hitbox. If we are not right on top of a monster, our Splitting Steel splits are not going to hit the boss as they return to us, giving us less DPS than expected. With us running Haste and with us getting a phasing Haste jewel, we can always be right on top of the enemy, meaning we're going to always be able to benefit from all of our splits hitting the boss, giving us substantially more DPS than the little bit of DPS the Wrath Watchers would have given us. What you can eventually do is actually be able to run both at the same time. With a lot of reservation efficiency across the rest of your build, you're going to be able to have just enough reservation efficiency to fit in both when you drop your precision. The way this is going to be accomplished is going to be very simple. You're going to first need a level 4 Enlighten, and there's simply no way around this. It has to be a level 4 Enlighten. Then you're going to have to get yourself a deafening mana reservation efficiency of skills roll on your chest plates and a Eater Worlds mana reservation efficiency of skills implicit, along with a double reservation efficiency of skills jewel, which is going to have mana reservation efficiency as a suffix and as a implicit. And then finally, we're going to be dropping precision from our build, which means you're going to need to get yourself a Resolute technique and Ephemeral edge, or you simply just have to drop your precision in general and deal with a little bit lower of a hit chance. And with all this put together, you should be able to turn on both Wrath and Haste with around 90 mana left over. This is going to be very expensive to fit in, but just due to the sheer DPS increase of having both at the same time, it's going to be highly worth it to try and get yourself the setup whenever you can, but I wouldn't rush it just due to the price of level 4 Enlighten being so high. And to finish up all the changes for our skills, we are going to be making one more change to our defensive layers. We're going to be completely dropping the seal skin and the automation from our build, as cast when damage taken Immortal Call is simply just superior. What we're going to want to do is specifically run a level 3 Immortal Call with a level 1 cast when damage taken. What this is going to do is it's going to cause pretty much every small hit against you to effectively give you a small defensive layer of less damage taken for a second. This is unbelievably powerful when it comes to multi-hit abilities such as Cyrus's Die Beam, and this by itself is enough to literally make that ability go from it can kill you almost every time it happens to it straight up will never kill you ever again. This is a very powerful defensive tool, and honestly, this should have been in the build from day one, but after doing some Uber bosses, I've just learned just how much better this feels over Sealskin, and I would encourage you to swap over as soon as you can. The final thing to mention here is because of the aura changes we're going to be making with adding in Enlighten and dropping Precision, you're not going to have as many gem slots as we did before. This means one gem is going to have to go, and the gem that we're going to be dropping is going to be Ancestor Protector. Not only is the Totem an annoying ability to use, which I'm sure a lot of people playing this build are going to be happy to know that we're completely dropping, but if you want to do bosses or high-end content with the Totem, it's literally just going to get one-shot by pretty much everything, meaning you're not going to really have great uptime on it in the first place. On top of that, it's also just not something you could realistically use while mapping, because putting down your Totem every screen while going through a map just sounds really annoying to do and just does not sound like fun gameplay. Because my builds are all about giving you comfortable playstyles, we're going to completely drop it, and we're simply just going to eat the 20% less CPS that we're going to do without it. Who cares in the first place? We already do too much damage as it is. And we're simply just going to stick to Smite as our only damage amplifier. What we learned about Smite is that there's actually a little bit of tech you can do with it to make it really comfortable to use. If you put it on your right click, and you just simply right click as you're holding down Splitting Steel, your character will momentarily stop doing Splitting Steels and do that one smite that you queued up before going back to just spamming more Splitting Steels. This means every 4 seconds, all you have to do is just a very quick right-click tap to get yourself a 20% DPS increase with very little effort on your part. This should make using Smite a lot comfier, and it should make it so you can use it while mapping with no issues to give yourself the DPS boost at all times. What you could also do is potentially get yourself a Vol Smite, which then is going to basically cleave the whole screen, and it's going to give you a lot more added damage, making it even better for clearing than a normal Smite. And with all that out of the way, let's talk about the gear changes that we're going to make in this build. Now, all of the rare items that we're about to go over are going to have their own crafting guide in the note section as well, which I'd highly encourage you for you to read if you want to make these items yourself. The first thing we should talk about is going to be the new helmet for this build. Now, because of corpse crafting, we can get ourselves some pretty cracked double fractured hubris's for very, very cheap. What we were doing prior was looking for just a 1 fracture hubris with a resistance on it that we needed, and then we were simply just using a woe essence to get ourselves tier 1 energy shield prefixes, and then finishing off the craft with a physical damage taken as fire roll. What we can instead do is now potentially look for a hubris that has a fractured energy shield roll on it, or a fractured second resistance, or fractured intelligence, or any sort of other useful fracture, which is going to allow us to get a substantially stronger helmet for even cheaper. If you get yourself a fractured % ES helmet, that means you're then going to use your woe essences to roll for a second resistance or intelligence or something else that's useful. Or if you get yourself a second fracture resistance or fracture intelligence, you're simply just going to use your woe essences as before to roll for tier 1% ES. You're then going to finish off this helmet by using Eater World Icarus to get yourself mana reservation efficiency of skills on it. And you're then going to use Exarch Embers to get yourself either elemental weakness, punishment, or conductivity curse effect. They're all just as good as each other, but the punishment curse effect won't show up as a DPS increase in Path of Building because the enemy is not set to low life. Moving on to our chest plate, oh boy, we are now going to be able to make ourselves a cracked chest plate. We are going to get ourselves a double fractured evasion and energy shield hybrid chest plate, which, because people are crafting en masse, is a very, very cheap base for you to be able to craft a pretty cracked chest plate from. What you're going to ideally want to do is get yourself a chest plate with no fractured suffix. A lot of these are going to have a fractured suffix, which is going to make the craft a little bit more expensive to finish, but it's okay if you end up getting yourself one for cheap. It's still going to be substantially stronger and substantially cheaper than pretty much any other chest plate you're going to be able to make. No matter what, you need to make sure one prefix on your chest plate is not fractured and is going to be open for you to be able to craft the Gravicus physical taken as hit hybrid roll. The way this is going to be crafted is going to be very simple. Once you get yourself a fractured base, you're just going to be spamming loathing essences until you hit tier 2 or tier 1 spell suppression, and then you're simply just going to craft the Gravicus hybrid roll on it. And if you do not have an open prefix to craft it because you rolled some random prefix, you're just going to use an Eldritch Annul to be able to annul the prefix specifically to then put the craft on it. Finally, you're going to use Exarch Embers and Eater World's Icarus to get yourself % maximum energy shield and increase effective auras. And we found that maximum energy shield is substantially better than discipline aura effect as it gives you substantially more ES. Moving on to gloves is going to be the same thing as the chest plate. We're going to want to look for fractured gloves with either fractured ES, lightning res, intelligence, attack speed, or whatever kind of roll we can find. And then we're going to use either attack speed essences or intelligence essences to finish up the suffixes before moving on to crafting the prefixes with a crafted damage while leeching roll to finish it up. For the rolls on the Eldritch Implicids, you're going to want to get yourself attack speed with Exarch Embers. And then for your Eater rolled Implicit, you're going to want to keep it as lightning exposure until you get yourself a level 5 awakened lightning penetration, which is then going to have lightning exposure by default on it, at which point you can remove the lightning exposure off your gloves for increased effective marks. Moving on to our boots, they are going to be crafted in the same fashion as before, except we're going to try to get ourselves a double or triple fracture on these as well. We're going to look for any sort of useful fractures between movement speed, energy shield, and resistances, and you're simply just going to want to use Shrieking Loathing Essences to guarantee chance to avoid elemental ailments, which is then going to pair with a chance to avoid elemental ailments Eater Worlds implicit on it to give you 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments, which then paired with an Ancestral Vision is going to give you your element immunity. Finally, moving on for our belts, this is going to also be a pretty easy craft to do as well. Now, belts are going to be a lot more expensive in terms of the base, as fractured Stygians are a little bit less common, but they're still abundant with quite a lot of different fractures available on them. You're going to want to get yourself either fractured strength or fractured ES at a minimum, and then you're going to use either of the two essences to get yourself the other roll with some resistances on it. Finally, if you have an open prefix, you're simply just going to craft elemental damage attack skills on it, and you're gonna have yourself a belt that you're pretty much gonna never replace until you get yourself a mage blade. The final thing we should talk about in this path of building is gonna be Nimis. Now, Nimis will be pretty much the last thing you want to get in this path of building. This is gonna be an item that literally doubles the DPS of your build. The reason for this being is that you're gonna be able to drop your returning projectiles gem completely, as Nimis has returning projectiles built into the gem itself. This means you don't need to deal with the 62% less multiplier on returning projectiles, and you're going to get a whole support gem back, and when we add the potential DPS of another support, you effectively double the damage of your build. Now, Nimis is going to be very expensive. This is an item that's used in quite a lot of builds and is a very powerful and effectively a double damage increase for every build that uses returning projectiles. Because of this, I would recommend for you to save for this and buy this as the last item you're going to get in this path of building, or if you feel like your gear is decent enough and you want to save for it, just go right ahead and save for it whenever you feel like you're ready. One thing I might recommend as you're saving for Nimis is to potentially buy yourself an Series Reflection if you don't already have one. Unfortunately, due to all the updates we made in this build, we have skyrocketed the price of its Series Reflection to a very high degree. And what I might recommend, if you don't already have one, is to just buy one when you can afford one and then just resell it when you have enough money alongside the value of the reflection to then buy yourself a Nimis. Reflection is very strong, but it's not mandatory in this build and it's not required, and you can just simply use some sort of rare shield until you can buy back your reflection. It's going to be substantially more important to afford Nimis as soon as you can. With all it put together, if you do get yourself everything in this path of building, your build is going to absolutely skyrocket all the way to the moon. You're going to be able to handle all tier 17 maps and Uber bosses with relative ease, and you should have no issue just tearing through every single bit of content that this game has to offer. Now, this is not going to be the final video for this build. This build can only go further and further from here. Over the next few days, we're going to have a whole video talking about how to fit a mage blood into this build if you do happen to get yourself a mage blood. And we're then going to have ourselves an endgame update for this build that's going to talk about mirror tier gear, adorned, and all the other super high-end items that we can add to make this build even stronger than it already is. If you have any questions on anything we discussed here, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below, and I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come by Twitch and ask me any questions you have there. Or if you simply just want to see me play the build and see all the new tech before anyone else, the best ways to find all that is going to be on Twitch. With all that said, I hope you kitties enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy playing your build and making it even stronger, and I hope to see you kitties in the next video for even more updates.